panelists represent different perspectives within the regulatory world, and that is very much by design. We will hear from an administrative lawyer, a representative from industry, and a regulator. Our chosen panelists all have experience outside of Ontario, as we saw this as an opportunity to hear about best practices from different jurisdictions. The dialogue today is a key part of the Top Quartile Regulator project that the OEB is currently undertaking, the goal of which is to modernize the OEB by examining the attributes of top quartile regulators, both in Canada and in other jurisdictions, identifying gaps in the OEB's own performance, seeking out best practices, and ultimately adopting best practices to address gaps and improve performance. So over to the panel. First, I am pleased to introduce Ben Wilson, who brings to today's discussion the utility perspective. He is familiar with Ofgem in the United Kingdom, the Australian Energy Regulator, and the Economic Regulation Authority for Western Australia. He is the CEO of Australian Gas Infrastructure Group, one of Australia's largest energy infrastructure businesses, serving more than 2 million customers. Previously, Ben was the Director of Strategy and Regulation and Chief Financial Officer at UK Power Networks, an electricity distribution company with 8 million customers. He is the Chair of Energy Networks Australia, former Chair of the ENA Gas Company, and a member of the Ministerial Advisory Panel for the Technology Investment Roadmap. Next, I would like to introduce you to David Mullen, retired Professor Emeritus from the Faculty of Law at Queen's University. With his expertise in constitution and administrative law, he brings to our panel the legal lens through which regulatory processes can be changed and improved. From 2004 until 2008, he served as Toronto's first Integrity Commissioner. From 1998 to 2006, he was a part-time member of the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, and until 2015, a part-time vice chair of the Ontario Workplace Safety and Insurance Appeals Tribunal. David is widely published in the field of administrative law and has advised various governments and agencies. Most recently, he was a member of the 3-person Alberta Utilities Commission's Procedures and Processes Review Committee. Our third panelist is Colette D Honorable, who brings the regulator's viewpoint. She is a highly regarded policymaker in US domestic and international energy sectors. She is a partner in the Global Energy and Natural Resources Group of Reed Smith LLP, and also serves as an independent director for Southern Company, a US-based energy company with 9 million customers in 7 states, and is a member of the Global Advisory Board of the Energy Futures Initiative. After receiving our presidential nomination in 2014, she joined the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, to serve as a commissioner until 2017. She is also a former president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners and past commissioner and chair of the Arkansas Public Service Commission. There's so much more to know about our distinguished panelists today, but I'm not going to say anything more, as we are keen to turn the conversation over to them to hear what they have to say. Finally, a few words about our moderator. Christine Long has served as registrar of the OEB since February 2019. She is the chair of CAMPUT this year and was previously a full-time OEB board member and served as vice chair for 2 years. Christine is a lawyer and former partner at Borden Ladner Gervais LLP, where she specialized in energy regulation, litigation, and corporate law. I can think of no better person to help steer the conversation to come. Christine, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Marianne, for that very warm introduction. And to the panelists, Colleen, Ben, and David, thank you so much for joining us today. I am really looking forward to the conversation. The first thing I'd like to do is unpack the term top tier regulator, or as you might hear us say, top quartile regulator. I'm wondering, Colette, if we can start with you, if you can tell us what that term means to you. How would you define it?
Thank you, Christine. And let me say before I begin how wonderful it is to be virtually with all of our CAMPUT friends. I miss you guys in person, and thank you in particular for your leadership. We have strongly enjoyed our partnership and collaboration with the Canadian regulator, and all of the individuals who give so much to CANPUT. So thank you so much for the invitation to you and to
thank you.
CEO
Thank you,
Zagar. When I think about what it means to be a top quartile regulator, I envision individuals who are committed to working and never stopping in doing their best work to serve the sector. I also think about a regulator that is independent. So I really enjoyed seeing the polling questions that you put forward. It's critical that a top quartile regulator operate in an independent way. The regulator has to make a number of very difficult decisions, high stakes decisions, and has to do so in a way that is free from influence from outside sources of any type, political, the business sector, and otherwise. And also a regulator that is very open and really paying honor to transparency and due process. These are some of the critical elements that I think instill and sustain confidence in the work of the regulator, builds trust and relationships, not inappropriate relationships, but strong working relationships that really are at the foundation of this work. I could go on with a number of other adjectives and attributes of the top quartile regulator, but why don't I pause to give time for our colleagues to join in?
Okay, well, I'm going to turn to Ben because I saw him nodding there as you were speaking. So it looks to me like maybe he's in agreement with some of what you said. Ben, can I turn it over to you?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. And likewise, great to be here. Really enjoy the opportunity to talk to everybody today. I think there's a lot of agreement with Colette. I'll actually start with how you measure it. How do you measure a top quartile regulator? And my view would be, it would be the same way you measure a top quartile regulated business, which is what are the outcomes we're getting for the public and for the customers. And let's start with the energy trilemma, right? So affordability, sustainability, reliability, and we can add in things like safety and customer service as well. I think if you've got top quartile outcomes in those areas for customers, then most likely you've got a top quartile regulator contributing to delivering that. So I think that's a great way to measure it. And of course, what that does is it drives alignment. And often there's too much focus, I think, on a zero-sum game, a win-lose dynamic between regulator and regulated companies. But actually, if you step back and look at it, we all want the same thing, which is those top quartile outcomes for customers. So I think that's how, at the highest level, one should measure it. What are some of the characteristics, behavioral characteristics of a top quartile regulator that helps to deliver it? I think, Colette mentioned a lot of those. I absolutely echo the behavioral type ones. Stability, predictability, transparency, accessibility, those things are really important, and they just go a long way to be able to operate in an efficient manner. And I'm sure we'll talk more about efficiency as well. And of course, Susanna mentioned that in her opening remarks. I do think there's something about promoting win-win areas where actually we can collaborate naturally, driving down risk in the sector that benefits everybody. And I think focusing businesses on outcomes for customers is another area where we can win-win.
Thank you, Ben. David, can I turn to you and ask what your definition of a top quartile regulator would be? Oh, I think you're on mute there, David. That's great.
I have very little to add to what Colette and Ben have described as their characteristics of a top quartile regulator. I guess one of the things that strikes me as interesting in the proposition of becoming a top quartile regulator is how do you actually measure it? And we've come up with a whole lot of things that we would value in the top quartile regulator, but how do we measure whether or not the OEB has actually achieved that particular status at any point in time? And so I think part of if the ambition is in measurable terms to become a top quartile regulator, it's absolutely critical that the OEB spend some time devising methodologies by which that particular question is going to be answered. Are we indeed a top quartile regulator? And I think in answering that question, we've got to, and some of this was implicit in, or explicit, I should say, in what Colette was saying, you know, in whose mind are we talking about when we're talking about a top quartile regulator? Who are the interested parties? Who are the stakeholders? How do we measure their reaction to the way in which the OEB has been functioning? And as one of my colleagues said recently, in relation to energy regulators, the most important or critical thing is, in a lot of ways, that they achieve respect across the range of stakeholders with whom they interact regularly, across the public's mind, and indeed respect in the minds of the government of the day. And so I think respect is important, vital, in fact, in any ambitions to become a top quartile regulator. The only other point that I would make from, I guess, a more legal perspective is a top quartile regulator is indeed one that attempts to balance the requirements of efficiency against the legal requirements of procedural fairness or natural justice, as it's sometimes called. And so from my perspective as a legally trained person, you know, that's one of the challenges I think that lies ahead for the OEB.
Thank you, David. And I mean, you raise a good point, and one of the reasons that we have three different perspectives on the panel is I think no matter who you ask, they may have a different definition of what a top quartile regulator is. If they're the regulator, if they're the stakeholder, if they're a regulated entity. So I appreciate your insights on that. I would like to move to our poll question. So we had asked our audience what they thought the key attribute of a top quartile regulator is. And I see the results here on the screen. So independence, 29%, accountability, 10%, certainty, 17%, effectiveness, 22%, and then efficiency. So a bit, so I'm going to turn to you, Colette, and each one of you have different backgrounds and different perspectives that you bring to this. So are you surprised by that result? And I guess what should the OEB take from the fact that, you know, those 5 attributes, I think there's, you know, a pretty equal response to each one of them.
Thank you. And before I respond to that, I want to say to David, thank you so much for speaking about balancing the interests. That's such a very challenging role of the regulator, and a top quartile regulator has to be especially focused on that in as much as the challenges are evolving and changing. So to Ben's earlier point about ensuring sustainable, affordable, reliable energy, we have to now take on a number of other factors in that, moving toward clean energy goals, making sure we are thoughtful about the environmental impacts of this work, and also from an environmental justice perspective. So David, I just want to say thank you for rounding out that group. What I took from the poll results was, whew, thank goodness. I talked first about independence. I think there is a great amount of consensus there. And what I also took from it is that these, you know, tens, over 100, almost 150 of us here are really focused on efficiency and how this work is done well and right. We are all working more and harder than we've ever worked. The challenges are greater than they've ever been. And I remember hearing that 15 years ago when I started in this work. And we have worked on that together for over a decade in the US and Canadian regulators in my time in this role. We have to find ways to do this work well and right, but to do it efficiently because we are all working on so many initiatives, and things are moving much more quickly now in this energy transition. So I take that to heart, and it is incumbent upon the top quartile regulator to work expeditiously and efficiently.
And do you agree with that? As a regulated entity, that efficiency is key?
Yeah, I think I do, Christine. I think I'll maybe just comment on independence as well and seeing that as top. I think perhaps we can read that a little bit in terms of the survey as what people are saying is independence, but trust, respect, confidence, right? If you view the regulator as independent, probably what you're really saying is you've got confidence in the decision-making and the outcomes that are coming out of the regulator. So I think that goes to some of the points that David has made. I think efficiency is really important because it's easy to add more and more process, more and more data in order to strengthen the outcome or to be able to defend the outcome. But actually, there is a point at which you get diminishing returns, and having the confidence to set an efficient process and the skill to set a process which is efficient but which still is demonstrably a good and fair outcome and people are happy with, I think it's really important. I'm sure we'll talk about it. I'm from the UK originally. I've been in Australia for the last 6 years. I've been impressed with how efficiently regulation works in Australia. I really think it's fit for purpose. It's not too much, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that.
Okay, we will. I'm going to ask you some questions about that a little bit later, Ben. But David, any messages that the OEB should take from the outcome of that poll? What are your thoughts?
The emphasis on independence is interesting, and I guess from a legal perspective, or someone who's legally trained, not at all surprising. I guess, however, that the concept of what legally independence means and requires in this particular setting, I think is a somewhat more nuanced and interesting question. One of the things that I did in preparation for this panel today is I conducted an informal poll of my own among 17 representatives of interest in this particular field. And I got a variety of responses, but one of the ones that didn't appear in your list of alternatives, which I think is absolutely critical in the current environment, is the importance of being diligent in terms of assembling together a backup staff to the regulator that actually is qualified, expert, and can develop for the benefit of those making decisions at a policy level, and also in terms of regulatory hearings can develop policies and processes that are credible, that are fact-based or science-based, and that in fact reveal a staff that is innovative, creative, nimble, and has the ability to respond to what is obviously, from what Colette and Ben have said, is a very quickly evolving field where there need to be adjustments made on an ongoing basis. And so from my perspective, I'd like to add to the list of things that, that the OEB has put together for this poll, the critical importance of a creative, agile staff as part of this, as an essential part of the whole enterprise.
Colette, I see you nodding. Do you agree with David's assessment of how important that is for a regulator to do their job?
Absolutely. And when I heard the CEO speaking about her role, it resonated with me a great deal. When I started at the Arkansas Public Service Commission, I had not worked in the sector. 3 months later, I became the chair. And I could not have possibly undertaken that work in an effective way if I did not have a top quartile staff. And this also means assessing what you have and what you need. But I couldn't agree more with David's points, because it will take many hands to carry out this important work. There are a number of stakeholders that really will serve as experts to help teach and inform the process. But it's critical that the OEB have a top quartile staff to help carry out this work.
Thank you, Colette. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and ask about prioritization. So as the OEB embarks on higher performance, we've seen some key attributes that people are looking for the regulator to have. But Ben, I'm going to turn to you first and ask, what is the roadmap for the OEB? Where do we start first in getting to higher performance?
I think a great place to start, Christine is focusing on stakeholder engagement, and clearly this event is part of that journey. And I think it's really exciting to see that front and center of the OEB's journey. So stakeholder engagement by the regulator, but also by the regulated companies. And there's no surer way, in my view, to get a good quality business plan out of a company and then eventually a good quality regulatory decision for the customer than to ensure that that's been widely consulted on. If the company's got to go out, discuss its plan with customers, with stakeholders, take on their feedback, share that widely, refine it before it's even submitted to the regulator, then chances are that's going to be a reasonable plan to start with in terms of outcomes for customers on price, customer service, and so on. It also then makes the regulator's job easier because you've got already a fact pattern of feedback from stakeholders, well, it's just the company's plan to move it. So I would really focus and really start on that. And certainly in the jurisdictions that I've worked in, stakeholder engagement by the companies and then evidence of having done that and that stakeholders by and large support the plan has become an integral part of the rate setting process. And it's made for much better plans and for companies which are actually more focused on the customer than on the regulator. Again, I think a really key measure of a top quartile regulatory system is maybe slightly paradoxically that the companies are actually focused on the customer and not solely focused on the regulator and viewing it as, right, I need to go into the regulator and get the best outcome that I can for myself. Should be thinking about the customer, and stakeholder engagement makes you do that. So I think that's a great place to start.
Can I ask you a little bit more about the process? So when in Australia, when you're having the discussions with the regulator, you've already talked to your customers, obviously, because that's part of what you do in the natural course. But are you having discussions up front with the regulator, talking about what your plans are, prior to your application coming in? And is there that dialogue, and that's what you're speaking to with respect to stakeholder engagement? Is that fair?
There is that, absolutely. And I think a good mantra for the relationship between the regulated and the regulator is no surprises, I have to say. And we try to achieve that when we deal with regulators. And the commitment I always make to the regulator is I will try my very best to make sure you get no surprises. So by the time I actually put in my formal what we call an access arrangement submission, like a reg case, by the time I get to put that in, I want it to be almost a non-event for the regulator because I've already told you what's going to be in it. You've also seen me consult with my customers. And again, I think it's really important that when you do go out and consult with the customers, you give them the full plan. And I think it's a real no-no to test willingness to pay, for example, on individual initiatives, if the customer doesn't have the overall picture of what is the overall price path that you're proposing, for example. So consult early, be visible with customers, the stakeholders, brief the regulator as the plan develops, and it might change a bit. And again, as a company, you've got to have confidence to sort of, open the veil so that that can be seen. By the time it actually then gets submitted to the regulator, it should be really a no surprises plan that goes in. And that builds back to a word that's already been mentioned today, which is around trust.
Okay. Next, I'm going to move to David. David, what do you think the first priority issue is for the OEB as it embarks on trying to reach higher performance? Oh, David, I think we got your mic off.
I agree totally with Ben in terms of engaging and getting the stakeholder engagement right off the top. I think it is absolutely critical to establish that reputation of stakeholder involvement right from the outset of the newly reconfigured OEB, if you like. I think the other thing that, and it relates back to what I had to say a few moments ago, is I think that it is absolutely critical also at the initial stages to develop hiring strategies that actually succeed in attracting to the OEB the kind of staff policy people that I was talking about in response to the previous question. And I think also, in terms of what we've been talking about to this point, it's critical also to, right from the outset, begin to think about performance assessment and devising ways in which you can actually measure performance in ways that are meaningful. And as far as meaningful is concerned, I think one will probably get buy-in to performance assessment from the staff of the OEB if in fact one regards the task of of a performance assessment as being basically institutional information rather than being seen as job assessment. Buy-in, I think, from the staff in terms of what you're trying to do, what you're trying to measure, is in fact best assured if it is regarded as an educational exercise, an informational exercise, rather than in any sense being threatening to jobs, threatening to positions.
Thank you, David. Colette, I'm going to turn to you, and I'm going to flip the question a little bit, and I'm going to ask you: is there anything that the regulator should not do, anything that the OEB should not do as it moves forward to try and reach higher performance?
Yes, I could come up with a long laundry list, in fact. One thing the regulator should not do is assume that they have all the answers, because when that occurs, you lose the elements that Ben and David have so eloquently spoken about. You lose the trust, you lose confidence, you lose certainty. And so it's critical that the regulator approach this role with a sense of discipline and humility, and with a strong notion of how to carry out the work, focusing on the mandate. What are the policies and rules that then must be implemented? And then picking up where Ben mentioned about this stakeholder process. What else should the regulator not do? The regulator should not bring his or her personal inclinations to the role. So that goes to embracing the mission. And for instance, in the US, when we were developing and implementing the Clean Power Plan, that it was not my role as a federal energy regulatory commissioner to say whether I liked or didn't like the plan. The plan was developed by the administration, and it was our role to provide advice and counsel on how that plan might impact reliability and resilience. So we have to approach this role with a full understanding and embracing of our respective roles. And finally, the regulator should not impose its will to supplant what is best for customers. So this will bring full circle this discussion that Ben and David and I have been speaking about. All of this work is focused on one person, one entity, and that's the consumer, and how we all do this work in a way that is accretive to, yes, the shareholder interest, but equally, if not more importantly, what is in the best interest of the consumer. And the regulator doesn't hold that card alone. It is through this very fulsome, open and transparent and collaborative process that we get to that place.
Thank you, Colette. Ben, anything to add to that on pitfalls that the OEB might want to avoid as it seeks its path of higher performance?
Yeah, sure. And I really like what Colette just said about making sure that we're focused on the outcome that's best for the customer as the kind of lodestar of what we need to do. And I think remembering to focus on incentives, I think is really important. I think when a regulatory decision is made, it's not just, is this a good decision which produces a good value for money outcome for the customer that provides reliability, sustainability, and so on, but also does the decision put the right incentives on the business so that those outcomes happen naturally and organically. And it goes to the point that actually the regulator is not going to be best placed to know actually what is achievable, what is the frontier of efficiency, of customer service, of reliability. Let's make sure the decisions have the right incentives there as well to push that performance. And I also do think that trying to keep the process simple, trying to keep the data requirements manageable on the companies, and again is this business of allowing the companies time to focus on the customer rather than too much on the regulatory process. Let's get through the regulatory process, let's get a good outcome, and let's get back to working on focusing on the customer. So a fit for purpose process.
Okay, good. That's good to hear. I'm gonna ask a few individual questions of each of you, things that are a bit more tailored to your experience. And the first one is for Colette. And Colette, I'd like to ask you, you know, you've been a state regulator, you've been a regulator at the federal level, and what do you think are impediments to good decision making? Because at the heart of, you know, being a top quartile regulator, I think it is making good decisions, making decisions that are in the best interest of the customer. But what gets in the way of doing that, and how could we address that in order to get, you know, higher performance? Any thoughts on that?
Thank you for that, Christine. The greatest one is something we've been speaking about today, but I want to put a finer point on it, and that is one critical impediment to top quartile regulation is a lack of coordination. We see it in its most perverse view as really regulatory hubris, where decisions are made in a vacuum, they're made quickly, they are made without proper information, maybe without a full record, and without these tried and true notions of due process, which underpin good decision making. In this work, I find that, and I found in my latter years as a regulator, keeping up with the pace of innovation, technological advancements were so challenging, but also refreshing. Rulemakings that may be associated with net metering, for instance, or siting issues. As these matters have evolved, you're juggling many things at once. It's critical for the regulator to always appreciate the importance of collaboration, not as something good to do, but as a must, and to strive to take into account every perspective as it makes its decision, as the regulator does. It doesn't mean that the regulator will agree with every perspective, but it's critical that the regulator approach this work with an open mind and to be open to wherever the road leads him or her. And many times when I was a younger regulator, a newer regulator, I would see an application and think, there's no way I would do that. I wasn't open. By the end of that proceeding, I was fully in support because I had to check my preconceived notions and thinking about what should happen and be disciplined and allow the law and the mandate and the record take me to where it would lead me. I think one other impediment is something that was mentioned earlier, Christine, and that is failing to get buy-in from stakeholders. I remember working as chair of the Arkansas Commission, developing comprehensive energy efficiency program plans. That means energy efficiency for every ratepayer class. Initially, Ben, when I approached this work, I thought there would be no reason at all to include incentives for energy efficiency. It ought to be done anyway. What are we talking about? But I came to learn that the stick approach wasn't the best approach, and the carrot and the stick might have been a little better, but the best way as we were launching this was the carrot approach, Ben. So you would have liked that very much because it moved all boats at the same time, rising them, and we were all rowing in the same direction. That was a critical element for us to gain buy-in from stakeholders, to be transparent with customers about this work and why it's important and why there would be some costs that would have to go into it, but also critically at the end of the day, everyone working to achieve the same goal.
Thank you, Colette. I'm going to ask Ben a question, and then David, I'm going to come to you for something with respect to process that Colette has talked a little bit about, but I just want to dig a little bit deeper, Ben. So you've had experience with Ofgem in the UK and with the AER in Australia. can you give us some examples of things that you think those regulators have done well, and what examples you think could be transferable to the OEB as it looks at higher performance levels?
Yeah, sure. I think there are some good examples from both regulators, both countries. I think a couple of things that Ofgem has done really well over the years is focus on driving down risk in the sector, and the second piece is the incentives piece. And on the risk thing, this is a real win-win. So Ofgem's got a very strong, very clear concept of a ring fence at the OpCo level. So if the credit rating falls to low investment grade, dividend blockers come in, dividends can't be paid, can't give security, you can't have cross guarantees outside of the OpCo. So for investors, it's very, very clear that lending to that entity is a very low risk proposition. That leads to a low cost of capital, right? And that allows them, the regulator, to set low rates. And so that's a win-win for customers. Also, we were already, ever since the financial crisis, but even more now with COVID, we're in a very low interest rate environment, and we're going to stay there for a very long time. And at very low rates of interest, it's really quite hard to achieve decent credit metrics, actually. And so one of the things that Ofgem pioneered was the ability for the companies to have flexibility on setting their speed of money. OPEX versus CAPEX balance, capitalization into the rate base of slow money, fast money. So you can set your own speed of money, make sure you've got enough cash flow to meet your credit metrics, even in a very low interest rate environment. And that just gives ratings agencies, investors, a lot of confidence. And that leads to a low cost of capital, which is a win-win. And the other observation I make about risk is probably the underlying inherent risk in the sector is going up, right, with all the change that we're seeing and capital having to come out of fossil intensive assets and going into low carbon assets. Inherent risk is probably going up. So the ability of the regulator to put an overlay on the sector which reduces risk, I think is really good. And I think Ofgem has done that really, really well. The incentive piece, I've talked about that a lot already, carrots and sticks, absolutely. Putting in incentives around, cost cutting, delivering good customer service, delivering reliability, but other kinds of incentives too, reputational incentives. So Ofgem required 10, 15 years ago now the companies to measure their customer satisfaction from their customers. And then there was a league table every month. And no management team likes to be at the bottom of the league table, even if there's no monetary penalty against it. And they have to explain to their board why they're in the bottom quartile. And guess what? That's the quickest way to get the sector focused, right? So those reputational incentives, marking business plans publicly. Again, nobody wants to be marked down as having put in a bad business plan. So I think incentives, financeability, a couple of things from Ofgem. Turning to the AER in Australia, I mentioned already, I do think of them as a very efficient regulator. And generally Australia, and this is not me being boastful because I'm from the UK originally, so I say this as an outsider looking at Australia, it's generally a pretty efficient, no-nonsense kind of a place, right? And the way that they do regulation is like that too. The data requirements, the complexity is much less than Ofgem requires. And also, the other thing I would say is the AER is not afraid to set fit-for-purpose regulatory regimes for different fact patterns. So we've got a variety of gas networks all around the country, different climate zones, big cities, small cities, towns. Some of our networks are fully regulated, where the regulator sets the price. Some of them are what they call light regulated, where we negotiate direct with customers, but there is an ability for either us or the customer to go to the regulator to make a decision if we can't agree. That's light regulation. And some of our networks are unregulated. And that's a view as to where the competitive pressure is. If you're in a warm climate zone in Australia, gas is really a lifestyle choice. It's about your outdoor kitchen and having a barbecue plumbed in. You don't need it for heating. So really the competitive pressure on the gas companies, well, I'll just go to electric appliances if I don't like what I'm getting from the gas company. Right. So does it need to be regulated? So that efficiency that the AER brings, I think, is excellent. And then I think a very specific innovation the AER has done over the last few years, the introduction of the Consumer Challenge Panel. So this is a stakeholder panel appointed by the regulator, which kind of follows the company through the rate setting process, through the regulatory process, acts as a critical friend to the company and to the regulator, submits its own report at the same time that the company's business plan goes in. And what it does is you've got a really good balance of, they are stakeholders, they are independent, but they're also resourced and they're experts, so they give very high quality feedback. And we've actually seen our consumer challenge panel even innovate in terms of policy. So they've been driving the regulator to think harder about the long-term future of gas, for example. So that we talk about stakeholder engagement. That consumer challenge panel, I think, is a really powerful innovation that's worked well. So there's a couple of thoughts for each country.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Ben. David, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about something that you've written quite extensively on, and that is the concept of more assertive case management on the part of the regulator as it considers an application. And I wondered if you could explain to us how you think that will help achieve higher performance.
Let me just give a little bit of background. My engagement with the whole issue of case management came as a result of the committee that I was on that was working on the processes and procedures of the Alberta Utilities Commission during 2020. And part of the reason for the establishment of that committee was a considerable concern expressed on the part, particularly of the regulated utilities, with the timeliness of decision-making within the Alberta Utilities Commission, and the length of proceedings that seem to be growing exponentially, at least in certain contexts. And as a consequence of that, the committee of which I was a member basically, and interestingly enough, looked to the courts for some guidance, because what we recognized is that in regular court proceedings in Canada, over the recent history of court proceedings, there's been a tremendous movement in the direction of very active case management in order to enable matters to proceed expeditiously. And so in large measure, and perhaps surprisingly, the committee took its guidance from what was happening in the courts when it was considering how do we deal with the complaints about timeliness that the commission had been hearing. And as a consequence of that, one of our principal recommendations was a recommendation for much more active case management in the context of rate setting hearings. But I think that's a recommendation that basically has some resonance across the range of things that utilities commissions are doing in Canada and elsewhere. The need for the commission to take control of proceedings to the extent of recognizing that it is the commission's responsibility to actually ensure that it carries out the mandate that is specified for it in its governing legislation. And if you conceive of processes being something that is attentive to the commission's need and the commission's responsibilities, then you take on a rather different perspective as to the way in which hearings should be conducted. Let me just move on a little bit and put three propositions to you that I think, in a sense, the committee that I was on rejected. The first proposition is that traditional adjudicative processes are the gold star, that one should attempt as far as possible to replicate traditional judicial or adjudicative processes. And I think fairly obviously, that is not on as far as the regulated community that we exist in is concerned. This goes back, the second one goes back to something that Ben said right at the beginning, and that is that there comes a point at which seeking more process or imposing more process leads to diminishing returns. And I think that's important in recognizing that in fact, the more you hear pleas for traditional adjudicative processes and more formality, the more that becomes a situation where it is not in the interest of those participating in the process that you respond favorably to that kind of request. And it also, I think, to the extent that you allow the participants, the stakeholders, to take control of proceedings, leads to the situation where, in fact, you're going to have participant capture of the regulator in a way that is not in the public interest viewed broadly. And it also, as we saw in Alberta, can lead to situations of dueling lawyers, and that, of course, is in nobody's interest. What was also happening in Alberta is that, in fact, those responsible within the organization had for a considerable period of time been taking a risk-averse posture with respect to process questions. The risk-averse nature of that posture was, under no circumstances should we expose the organization to applications for judicial review in the regular courts. That's to be avoided at all costs, the consequence of that being that you strive for a perfect record, you strive for as much information as is at all possible, and in the end, that becomes a self-defeating strategy. And so our recommendations for more aggressive case management, for changes to the procedures were conditioned upon a rather different sense of what process required in rate regulation under the Alberta legislation. But I would also venture to suggest it also has some lessons to be learned for the policy-making roles of bodies such as the Ontario Energy Board, not to mention the Alberta Utilities Commission.
Well, I think exactly, David, and I think it goes to the point of what Ben was saying, you know, fit for purpose regulation, and depending upon what it is, what the application is, there may actually be a different process that, you know, ties in what Colette says about everything that a decision maker needs, but perhaps we need to re-examine the process in each case. We are coming close to running out of time. So I do want to let people know, I'm sure we could have continued talking for 45 more minutes, but I do want to give some time to our audience who I'm sure have some questions based upon what we have been talking about. So I am going to open the chat up. It is